Are you obsessed with achieving grades that look as good as your favorite movies? Are you obsessed with getting the most accurate adjustments, sweetening your image in the same way that a DP would on set? If so, are you using the camera raw controls? Well, it's time to stop because it's slowing you down and it's actually making you a worse colorist. In this video, I'm going to show you why, and then I'm going to show you what you can use instead so that you're still getting those accurate results, but you're gaining speed and the creative advantage that's hidden in your other color grading tools. So let's start by talking about why I think it's a mistake to use your camera raw controls to grade your image. Number one, when we use our camera raw controls to grade our image, it forces us to stay in what I call a camera-centric way of working. That simply means that we are aware of our camera throughout our color grading process. We might even be changing the way that we are color grading based on our knowledge of that particular camera. When what we really want to be doing is grading in what I call an image-centric way of working, where we are not thinking about, we may not even be aware of the camera that our image was gathered on, and instead we are focused solely on the image and on shaping it in the direction it needs to go, using the same tool set and the same approach, regardless of whatever camera it may have originated on. When we're using camera raw controls to make our adjustments, we really can't inhabit that image-centric way of working. Number two, there's nothing that we can do in our camera raw controls that we can't do just as well or better elsewhere inside of Resolve. And this second reason is really what we're going to focus on and prove out over the course of the next few minutes here when we get hands-on in Resolve. So let's dive in and take a look at some of the things that I see people most commonly reach for in the camera raw controls with the notion that there's something special or unique that can only be done here or that is best done here that we won't be able to do as well or at all anywhere else inside of Resolve. First thing on that list, the one that comes up all the time with camera raw material, is ISO. Let's take a look at this shot here, which is, as we can see, underexposed by quite a bit. And by the way, before I go any further here, I've already set up my color management. I've already got that in place. I've already got a look in place that's coming from my look development plugin Contour here at the timeline level. I'm not going to do a deep dive on color management here today, but you need to have this in place for everything that we are going to do from this point forward to work and to make sense. So if you need to brush up on color management or you'd like to see how I set up my specific way of color managing my images here inside of Resolve, we've got some good videos on that here on the channel that I will leave links to in the description for today's video. For now, we're going to press forward and take a look at the current problem in front of us where we want to adjust the exposure of our image, and we're going to evaluate what happens if we use ISO versus another approach here. So if I go into my camera raw tab and I'm going to say decode using clip, I could indeed use ISO to get a stronger base exposure. This feels a good bit under right now. It feels to me maybe around 2 stops under. So let's just try taking our ISO from 250 up to 1000, which would be 2 stops. And if I grab a still of that, I've got a reference point for my ISO being opened up here. And I think that's a really good start. That's certainly a much healthier foundation than we had a moment ago, right? But I want to try something else here. Let's set our ISO back to 250, and we're going to take a different approach to opening up our exposure for this image. For this, I'm going to go over to the HDR palette, and I'm going to go to my global wheel that I have right here, and I'm going to grab for the exposure and open it up by exactly 2 stops. I'm going to try to hit 200 right on the nose. And check out what happens when I go off and then on. It's pretty darn similar to what we just did, right? Let's find out how similar. If I wipe to what we just did, here is ISO boost, here is HDR global boost. Those aren't similar. Those aren't close. Those are identical, right? And when we understand what's going on in both of these adjustments, it makes sense. The exact same process is being applied. We are applying gain in a linear domain in powers of 2. Linear gain in powers of 2. That's all that's happening here. That's all that's happening when we make that ISO adjustment. So it's clear, at least in this example, that there is no difference between making an ISO adjustment versus making an adjustment here in my HDR palette. And there are, in fact, advantages to making my adjustment here in the HDR palette because I can do this on any shot, not just a camera raw shot. This helps me to move into that image-centric mode of operation that I emphasized as being so important a couple minutes ago. Just working in an image-centric way when you're color grading is instantly going to make you a better colorist because it's going to allow you to focus more on the image and to forget about the camera, okay? So let's take a look at one more example here and make sure this isn't a fluke. How about shot number 2? Another situation I feel like I see come up all the time where we say, wow, I really want to recover my highlights in here. I want to see what's in the sky. And for the moment, I don't even care about this. I just want to bring everything down so I can see if I can bring some of that information back from the sky. Once again, let's go to our camera raw, and I'm going to set my ISO. Instead of going up 2 stops like we did a moment ago, let's try going down 2 stops. So we're at 400 right now. 2 stops down would be 100. And if I look at where I've netted out here, definitely a lot more information. I've got texture, I've got color that wasn't there before. Even on this hot side, same thing. I've got some texture starting to emerge that was completely nuked and clipped out in my prior ISO setting, right? Oh, and it looks like I even set my ISO a little bit hotter than I meant. Let's try actually going to 100. So all the more so there, we're recovering our highlights quite nicely here. There's a good bit of info in there. This is a great sort of like use case for ISO because the idea is like, wow, we're able to get as much as possible out of the camera raw negative that we can. And we're able to get more than we're going to be able to anywhere else inside of Resolve. But let's once again put this to the test. I'm going to grab a still and let's just label this. We'll call this -2 ISO. And now we're going to set our ISO back to where it was at 400. Once again, go to our HDR palette and try to spin this an exact even 2 stops down. And what are we going to see when we do that, when we compare? Identical image. No difference in the baseline operation, no difference in the quality of the operation or in how much of those highlights are being recovered. We're getting the exact same thing. And again, that's because the exact same process is actually being applied in both cases. So we can see from these 2 examples, the notion that ISO is something that we have to adjust here. And if we're looking to get a stronger base exposure, if we miss it with ISO, then we're never going to be able to make up that ground elsewhere. It's simply not the case. As long as you're using the right tools inside of Resolve, you can get the same results and get a better overall process because you're able to work in an image-centric as opposed to a camera-centric way. And not surprisingly, let's go back to shot number 1 for a second here. The same is going to hold true for the exposure slider in our camera raw controls. So let's just see how that's going to net out here. If I go back to my baseline settings here, and I'll decode using my clip again. And for this, let's try an exposure adjustment. I'm going to reset this exposure adjustment that we did in our node. And let's say we're going to do something extreme. We're going to go open by 3 stops now using our exposure adjust. I'm going to grab a still of that. We'll say +3 exposure. And let's now set that back to base and match it, or to 8 in this case. That's a look, right? Let's try 0. And we're once again going to go back to our HDR palette here and open things up by an even 3 stops. And let's see what we get when we do that. Once again, identical, not just in what it's doing, but in the quality of what it's doing, right? Like highlights, shadows, whatever can be held is being held equally well in both scenarios, okay? So ISO exposure adjustment, no advantage to making those adjustments in the camera raw controls. And in fact, there are quite a few disadvantages to doing so. Let's now move on and let's talk about the other thing that I see most commonly reached for and clung to in the camera raw controls as special and something that can't be replicated anywhere else inside of Resolve. That would be color temperature, okay? This shot is one form of color temperature that we often want to make when we're grading, which is more of a corrective form. Like when I look at this image, let's assume that the warmth that we're seeing here does not reflect creative intent. It just reflects a correction that needs to be made. And it's more of a fix that needs to be adjusted as opposed to having some sort of creative direction I want to push this image in. I more am saying, well, I would like my camera to match the color of the light that's being actually used in the scene. And we can see, because we are using a camera raw shot, the temp that the camera was rated for was 4,500. And I'm going to make an educated guess here that the actual temperature of the light in this room was closer to like 3,300, 3,400, something pretty close to tungsten. That's my educated guess, just based on the type of fixtures that we're seeing and on the warmth that we're seeing in the image overall. So if we wanted to make a camera raw play to fix that, I could simply set my color temp to 3,400, like so. And that works. I'm certainly like closer to neutral than I was before, right? But again, I'm using my camera raw controls, which kind of carry other downsides. So let's just stage a shootout here like we did previously. I'm going to go back to my default settings here. And for this scenario, this is one of 2 techniques that I want to show you guys. This technique that I'm going to show you is fairly specific to when you want to make a corrective adjustment, when you know what the camera was rated for, or you've got a good guess of what the camera was rated for, and when you know what the illuminant of the actual scene was, what the color temperature was in the actual scene. It's not often that you're going to be making a correction and have knowledge of or educated guess of both the camera's illuminant setting and the illuminant being used in the scene. But when you are making that kind of corrective adjustment, and when you do know those things, a really good tool to break out is your chromatic adaptation. So I'm just going to grab this from my effects menu here and drop it onto this node. And there are different ways to conceptualize what we're going to do here, but I think the easiest way for me to conceptualize it is currently, before having done anything in this node, this right here is a lie or a mistake, right? What we're really saying when we rate our camera for a particular temperature is you should expect a scene illuminated by that temperature of light, right? In this case, that's a lie. The temperature of the light illuminating the scene is not 4,500. It's closer to 3,400, as we said. So what I'm going to do with my chromatic adaptation is I'm going to try to make this lie true. I'm going to try to change the temperature of the light in this scene to 4,500. Okay? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to set our target to color temperature 4,500. That's where we're trying to go, right? I'm trying to get the image to 4,500 so that the camera's rating is appropriate. Second thing that we're going to do is go to our source illuminant, color temperature, and this is where I'm going to set it to 3,400. I'm saying this is where we started, this is where I want it to go. Now, let's do a comparison of our two. Here is our camera raw color temperature adjustment. Here's our chromatic adaptation. Now, if you look closely, you can see a little change in the image, and you can see a little bit of a difference in the histogram and in the vector scope. So this is a slightly different scenario than what we were seeing with our exposure and ISO adjustments. And that's really because what we are doing here, chromatic adaptation, by the way, that's what's happening in your camera raw controls as well. Simply a different form of chromatic adaptation. Chromatic adaptation has no closed, single, absolutely correct solution to it. Unlike exposure and ISO, which is simply linear gain in powers of 2, there are simply different methods that are used to achieve reasonable chromatic adaptation. You can even see this here in the chromatic adaptation plugin. There's like 8 or 9 different methods for getting to the outcome. They're all going to be pretty close, especially with smaller manipulations like we're doing now, but they're all slightly different, right? So my assertion here is that there is a difference here, but it is a small difference, and it is not a meaningful difference in the sense that, wow, it's always better, or it's definitely way more correct here than there, or vice versa. They're just slightly different renderings that if one was ever more preferable than the other, you would simply grade your way through that little difference to a desirable outcome. So a bit of a difference here between the camera raw and the chromatic adaptation, but not one that I find significant whatsoever. I've never seen a situation where I'm like, oh man, I wish I could just get that camera raw adjustment because it looks so much better than the chromatic adaptation. They're really going to be within very close striking distance of one another. As I said, this is one of 2 techniques that I want to show you, and this is actually going to be in the minority. You're going to be doing this one far less than what we're going to talk about next. What we're going to talk about next is a different scenario. This is a scenario, far more common scenario, where I simply want to change the balance of the image to make it look more like I want it to look. It's not a very scientific assignment, but that's most of color grading, right? Like, hey, make it look more like what I want to see, right? Color balance is one of the key ways that we do that. So for me, it's been an important step in my journey as a colorist to move off of the tight adherence to the idea of a correct color balance and allow myself the freedom to find the color balance that feels right, as opposed to trying to find the color balance that is objectively, measurably correct because it says color temp and because I did it in the camera raw tab. In my opinion, in most cases, anytime we're making a creative, preferential, subjective balancing adjustment, which is basically always, we don't really need to be concerned with what is right. We need to be concerned with what feels right. Now, with that said, there are some parameters and some principles that we can use to get to that outcome consistently when we're grading outside of the camera raw tab. Because here's what I will say. My contention would be in the camera raw tab, one of the reasons why we tend to like using this color temp slider is because it is very clean up and down the tone scale. If I go warm, the whole image feels like it is uniformly warming, not getting warmer in the highlights and less warm in the shadows or vice versa. When I go cool, same thing. I really feel like I'm uniformly adjusting the image in a photometric way, in a way that feels like I am changing the color temp on my camera, right? So that's a good thing. And that's something that is, a prop that we do need to give to the Camera Raw tab. It does a good job of that. But if we choose the right tool inside of Resolve, we can get the same feeling of that nice, even distribution across the low, medium, and high tonalities of the image, where we're getting that balance effect. So let's try, instead of using our color temperature here, we're just going to freehand our balance. And we're going to right click on this node, set our gamma to linear. This is, by the way, how I have my balance node set up in my template node graph. This is how I balance 95% of the images that I balance, is using linear gain. And let's watch how we can kind of work our way through this now. So I'm going to go to my primaries, I'm going to grab my gain, and I'm just going to preferentially move this where I want to see it go. Well, if you're like me, you might be asking like, well, how do I know where to go? I've got all this freedom. I could go left, right, up, down. What's the sort of guiding principle? How do I know what's going to work? I have two principles that I use when I'm balancing using linear gain. When I'm balancing in general, I just happen to do so with linear gain because I think it nets the best result. Here are the two principles. Number one, I'm trying to max out color separation. Easiest way to explain what I mean when I say that is to give you really low color separation for a minute. Check this out. This would be like very low color separation. Whole image is being washed into this kind of like orangey red color. The entire mass of my vector scope is living in one quadrant. I have very low color separation. I'm moving into like a pushed, washed, almost like monochrome type of look here, right? So what would the opposite of that be? The opposite of that would be trying to take this signal mass and move it in such a way that it is touching as many of my quadrants as possible, at least two, ideally more. So if I start moving on that basis and I try to get some of this pushing more squarely into my blue cyans, and I try to make sure I'm not swinging way too green or way too magenta, then I can start to balance out the image into a position where I'm really maxing out color separation. That's principle number one. Always looking for color separation. Color separation is easy to lose and hard to create, generally speaking, so we want to be looking for opportunities to introduce it, generally speaking, when we're grading. So that's principle number one. Principle number two, I want to flatter my subject's skin. Most of the shots that I grade have people in them, and I want to make sure that anything that I do, whether it's balance or anything else, is going to flatter their skin. At the very least, it should not make it look worse, and ideally it's going to make it look even better, which I think is happening here as we move slightly away from this like kind of magenta pinky push that his skin was starting to take on into a bit more of a natural and flattering rendering of his skin. So even though I'm freehanding this here, and I've got a lot more than just a slider for color temperature, which is sort of appealing in its simplicity, I have principles that are guiding me so I don't feel like I'm just getting lost and spinning the trackball in all three directions without much context or concept for where I need to take it and how I'll know when I've gotten there. Make sense? Max out that separation, make that skin tone look good. That's going to start to sort of narrow you to a particular setting of your gain trackball that's going to get you a nice, strong baseline image that should carry you through the rest of your grade. So that's a really fast overview of how I think about Camera Raw controls and why I have, for a long time, stopped using Camera Raw controls in my color grading, because as we said toward the beginning of this video, there's nothing we can do in our Camera Raw controls that we can't do elsewhere, and there are downsides to using our Camera Raw controls. Forces us into that camera-centric mode of operation. It's slower because it's really not part of our node graph or our color tools. It's just a bunch of sliders that are over here that are not meant for what we're using them for. We're using them to manipulate the image when really what they're there for is to tee up the image for manipulation, for color grading. So I hope you enjoyed this exploration of what we can do outside of our Camera Raw controls, how we can achieve the same level of precision and accuracy and sort of clean operation without needing to rely on the Camera Raw controls. And as a sort of like bonus, how we can also get faster results and how we can have some more creative freedom to arrive at the creative outcomes that we're looking for in our color grades.